Hey, welcome back. This is Shah. As we all know, the war between the Red Pillars and TradCon started a few days ago, and since then, there's been some notable updates that I want to bring to you. The most significant of which is Ben Shapiro came out and made a video called Do Not Take This Red Pill. What we saw originally is Matt Walsh made a video basically equating red pillars with feminists, and he basically said red pillars because they're advocating for men not to get married are cowards and they're the worst evil, as his tweet put it. We now have Ben Shapiro, who's basically, Matt Walsh's boss. Ben Shapiro is the person who created and founded the Daily Wire, which is the organization Matt Walsh is a part of. And Ben Shapiro seems to be doing a little bit of damage control, so let's see what he has to say.
Well, folks, there's something called the Red Pill movement. It's sort of a far-right movement that focuses in on saying the unsayable, and now many of the red-pilled have taken the position that it's bad for men to get married. A fascinating debate has broken out about the value of marriage. It's really interesting. So there are a bunch of people on the so-called red-pilled right who have now suggested that marriage is bad for men, that men should not get married. Now, the case that they're making is not the liberal feminist case that basically men are useless and terrible and a woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle or anything like that. The case that they are making is that the stakes of marriage have been changed by things like no-fault divorce, custody arrangements, the child support payments and all the rest, spousal support, that basically the legal regimen has made it not a bargain for men to get married. Now, I agree with the critique of all of those policies. I think no-fault divorce is a disaster area. I think that the child custody arrangements that basically always go to mom no matter what, that is a serious problem. When you shift the incentive structure, there's a reason why the majority of divorces, the vast majority of divorces, are now initiated by women. That is not because in the past women were wildly abused and today they are wildly liberated. What that really is when you shift the incentive structure and it turns out that all the risk is now taken by men, women are going to be the ones who actually activate and push that divorce button. However, the red-pilled have taken it one step further. And now they're telling young men, you should not get married. It's too dangerous to get married. Don't get married. That's foolish. That's foolish. So let's go through some of these arguments because they become very popular on the right.
It's interesting because he's kind of taking a different approach. He's not condemning them as much as Matt Walsh did, and he does admit several times in the video that the marriage laws are basically biased against men and that the red pillars are right about that. He's trying to find a middle ground here.
So let's start with Pearl Davis. So Pearl Davis is an anti-feminist who has become pretty popular these days. A lot of people label her sort of a female Andrew Tate, although without the checkered past. And here is Pearl Davis talking about marriage.
The TradCons, Daily Wire conservatives are saying that Pearl's just a doom and gloomer who lies about stats, just focuses on the negatives, never the positives, and all the men complaining are just crybabies. And so one day he comes home and he finds out that his wife had called the police on him and told them that the first time they hooked up 10 years ago, he had quote unquote raped her. And the truth of the matter is, when a man has children, they're not his kids. A man has no way to have children and those kids be actually his. They're always hers because the courts give the women custody 90% of the time, and rich men are really the only ones that have the money to fight it and the time. So I asked the Daily Wire, Jeremy Boeing, Matt Walsh, is this just crybabies? Are they just they're crybaby, weak men who don't man up and want to risk that? So, it's interesting because instead of demanding that the laws change and demanding women face repercussions for doing this stuff, you guys demand that men need to step up and take part in a system that discriminates against them. You say, oh, find a girl that prays, she won't do it. And I had this thought too, until I found a Muslim girl that did the same thing. I found a Christian girl that did the same thing. I found a Catholic girl. It's happening all over. Whether you want to believe it or not, it is happening. I don't care about your religion. I don't care about your church. This happens everywhere.
Okay, so
in my last video, I was annoyed that Matt Walsh was pretty much kind of making Pearl the face of the red pill movement because there's so many other creators like, Coach Greg Adams, Better Bachelor, the list goes on of people he could be talking to about these problems. But I do got to give Pearl some flowers here. She's presenting the arguments very well, and I will give her that.
The argument that she's making against it, all these marital policies, those are correct arguments, and nobody is disregarding the pain of men who have been wrongfully victimized under these circumstances where the incentive structure is completely stacked against them. That is true. However, the benefits of marriage are still unbelievable. It does matter who you marry. To pretend that there is no difference between the person that you marry, that it's happening with Christians and Muslims and it's all the same, that's statistically untrue. There are things that you can do to mitigate against the risk of divorce, and the person that you marry is the chief mitigation. The truth is that in the Jewish community, we always have a backup plan in the sense that every marital contract is a prenup. Every marital contract is a prenup, right? A Jewish ketubah is a prenup. It guarantees certain levels of spousal support, for example. If you give a get, then it makes prior arrangements and all the rest. But one of the things, throwing out the baby with the bathwater is not the solution. So how about both? How about we revise the system of law? But also, in the meantime, you do need to find a spouse and get married to her. And if what it requires for you to feel comfortable doing that is to shift away from the state mandated law and toward a contract arrangement, then do that as well. Right? We can have churches that sponsor that sort of thing.
So it's interesting that he said that. So, in my first video on this, the reaction to the Matt Walsh video, the one thing I brought up was how come Matt Walsh isn't suggesting as a solution that men and women still get married, in a spiritual way, in a kind of covenant marriage with their respective religious institutions, but they just don't sign the state mandated, marriage license. That was never addressed in his video, and it's actually really interesting to see Ben Shapiro suggest that as a solution, because what I'm seeing so far in this war between the tradcons and the red pillars is that they're pretty much saying the red pillars are saying like never get married, when the red pillars I think more so are saying don't give up your freedom to the state in that way, because you're going to get screwed over. And Ben Shapiro acknowledges as much. What we talked about in the last video though was that most, if not all, churches in the United States that will officiate a marriage still expect the participants to sign the state marriage license. If there are churches out there that will do a wedding for somebody that doesn't require them to also then sign the marriage license, maybe that's something that could work. But I think that as a solution is something that more people should focus on.
Because the truth is that those are enforceable contracts in court very often, the pre-custody arrangements and all the rest of that sort of thing. I want to go through some of the stats with regard to the benefits of marriage, because I think that it's also possible to exaggerate how bad things are for men. That doesn't mean they aren't really bad for men who end up divorced, or that women aren't divorcing men at an incredibly high rate overall, or that women aren't initiating the vast majority of divorce. Like, again, I agree with many of the critiques of current marital law. I agree with a lot of that stuff. The problem is that when you take it so far that you say that the solution for men is to not get married, now what you have done is you've created a second order effect where unmarried men become actual menaces. Okay, the reality is that men channel their aggressive drives toward building, or they channel it toward destroying. And a system in which women are unmarried and men are unmarried, that's something that the left wants. And if you acquiesce in that, then you actually end up destroying the very fundamental basis of society that allows for the growing and building of a society beyond the leftist principles.
What he's discussing here is pretty much an extreme where men and women aren't coming together to form families. It's that the men aren't getting married, and he's pretty much saying the red pill is stopping men from even going towards family creation. If they go with the solution of people able to form family units but maybe not getting the state involved, that could help solve the problem. I'll tell you this, like when I worked at the child support agency, I seen two kinds of cases come across my desk. We had to open up cases with people who had kids out of wedlock, and then there were cases for children born within a marriage. It was a lot easier for men to deal with the child support agency if they're just dealing with the child support case, if they weren't also dealing with a divorce case at the same time. Our society has actually built up a set of legal framework that operates outside of marriage in the form of the child support agencies, in the form of the voluntary declaration of paternities that allow men to establish paternity over a child when they're born, and with custody court. All of these operate outside of the marriage wheelhouse. A man or a woman could walk into a child support agency and get that figured out, whether it's paternity or child support. And a man or a woman can also go file a custody order for their child if they're not able to see their child, and that has nothing to do with being divorced. Before all that stuff was made, marriage was more about making sure that families had that stuff figured out with that contract. But since society has created these separate legal frameworks, it's actually given people less reason to sign the marriage contract, ironically, because there are these other legal structures here that exist now that help deal with those problems.
My answer to Pearl is both and. But yes, get married. And also, we should work to change those laws. Brian Atlas was on the Whatever podcast, and here he was talking about marriage.
Would you consider a prenup?
Prenups are regularly thrown out all the time. They're typically non-enforceable, especially the longer the marriage goes on, the less likely they are to be enforced. Men get absolutely destroyed in marriage and in divorce. Financially, when it comes to the kids, women are more likely to get custody. And then also, if you do get a divorce, the financial cost of just getting the attorney, getting all that involved. If it's a contested divorce, you're going to spend mid 5 figures, 6 figures on attorneys. And you got to pay for her attorney too. 50% of marriages end in divorce. 80% of divorces are initiated by women. 90% if she's college educated. 90% of child support payments go from men to women. 97% of alimony payments go from men to women. You have no fault divorce. So a woman can cheat on you. She can still get half her shit.
Okay. Again, a lot of what he's saying is true. The stats on marriage are not completely true. I'll go through those in just 1 second. Again, the rip on the divorce law is a good rip. It is a fine rip. And the answer is not for men to avoid marriage. The answer is for men to find a good woman to get married to who is committed to values. Yes, of course, marriage is a risk. Of course it is. And that risk is disproportionately borne by men at this point. That is true also. But is the reward worth the risk? The answer, in a huge majority of circumstances where both people are committed, like say, share Christian values, for example, the risk is worth it, is the basic principle. Again, these arguments are made not just by people like this. Andrew Tate has made the same sorts of arguments. Here's Andrew Tate talking about how men don't benefit from marriage.
I think it's a fantastic environment, and I think in an idealistic world, that's the way it would be. I think the reason it's not happening today is that I don't think many men actually benefit from marriages or relationships anymore. And people are always going to have to require some degree of incentive. I think that we've set up the world now in a way where men are seen as worker droids. They're expected to go work all day, come home, clean up as well, share the cleaning with the woman, no meal prepared for them, not have any authority over the household, and just be a worker droid and be sad. And I don't think that many people understand that men are intrinsically wired to desire respect amongst our peers and in our environments. This is why CEOs work so hard, because they get respect in their company.
Okay, so again, I don't disagree with much of what he is saying, but the solution, very often with the red pill kind of movement, the diagnosis is correct and the solution is wrong. Do the laws need to change? Absolutely, and they need to change. They're garbage. I totally agree with that. It is easy for men to be victimized under these circumstances. It's so easy that you should not enter the risk. Well, let's look at some of the upsides and the downsides. Here's a chart from Brad about opioid overdose deaths by gender, educational attainment, and marital status. And what you see is that among men, if you are single, never married, what you see is that the opioid overdoses per 100,000 age 25 plus, it's like 25 for single, never married men. It is even higher for divorced men, and it is extremely low for married men.
I got to be honest here. So let's look at this. He gives us a chart, and he's basically saying it's better to get married because opioid overdose deaths by gender, educational attainment, and marital status is less for someone who's married. And he's making the case that you're less likely to die in this manner if you're married versus if you're single. Or you're divorced, and there's an educational split here. What I find kind of weird about this is like, why would you choose a chart that's specifically opioid overdose death? Why not choose a chart that is about the rate of suicides amongst men and what their marital statuses are, whether or not they were married, divorced, or single or never married? Let's look at what that data says. Okay, so here's a research report, Marital Status and Suicide in the National Longitudinal Mortality Study. For the entire sample, higher risks of suicide were found in divorced than in married persons. Divorced and separated persons were over twice as likely to commit suicide as married persons. Being single or widowed had no significant effect on suicide risk. So here it says, previous studies have reported a link between marital status and suicide. They have shown that married persons experience lower suicide rates than single, never married people, and that divorced, separated, and widowed persons have the highest rates. These are the key points. Increased risks of suicide were observed among divorced and separated men, but not among women. So that's interesting because it could indicate, since women typically benefit from divorce in the sense that the laws, as Ben Shapiro himself admitted, are skewed in their favor, they're going to be less likely to have an increased risk of suicide because, you know, they get the kids 90% of the time, they get the spousal, they get the child support. It's typically them who initiate the divorce in the first place, where men tend to lose on that end. However, being single or widowed had no significant effect on suicide. Results obtained remained even after adjusting for socioeconomic and demographic variables. Having rejected the null hypothesis of no effects of the control variables, the next step was to determine the effect of marital status after adjusting for the effects of socioeconomic and other variables. As may be seen in Model 2, Table 1, divorced and separated people were over twice as likely to die from suicide as their married counterparts. Not only was the impact of divorce and separation on the risk of suicide not reduced, but it actually increased. It went from 1.76 in Model 1 to 2.08 in Model 2, reflecting an increase of 18%. Other marital status categories, being single, widowed, or having unknown marital status, were unrelated to suicide. If we're going to take this research report to mean anything, people who are never married or remain single don't have as high a suicide risk as someone who gets married and, you know, it doesn't work out for them. Which the red pill people are saying there is a huge chance, 50-50, that that's going to happen to you, which is why they're avoiding it. I think what I really take away from this video is that Ben Shapiro is scared. The tradcons are scared here, and let me tell you why. I think Matt Walsh came out and put a very clear divide between the red pill manosphere and the tradcons. And what Ben Shapiro sees that Matt Walsh probably doesn't see as clearly is that the red pill manosphere men who are frustrated typically vote for people on the right. They're not voting for progressive liberals that are typically feminists. I think what Ben Shapiro saw here is that Matt Walsh is alienating that base of voters, which I think represents a significantly large voting bloc, these young men. If those young men decide that conservatives and the tradcons aren't looking out for them, they won't vote for them anymore. And what's coming up next year? Elections. If those guys decide not to vote, even if they don't vote for the progressives and the liberals, let's just say they don't vote for the conservatives lose next year's election. I think Ben Shapiro knows this. If the progressive liberals are smart, what they will do is offer an olive branch to the red pill frustrated men and start selling this idea of some kind of marital reform or some kind of family law reform if they vote for them. The problem is that the way the progressive left and the way that the tradcon right sees marriage reform is fundamentally different. The tradcons mainly rail against no-fault divorce, and I think what they're going to sell is let's move back to at-fault divorce. But the truth of the matter is that no-fault divorce happened for a reason. You know, we started seeing the rates of divorce, or at least the requests for it, increase as, you know, the sexual revolution happened, feminism started becoming a bigger movement, and the courts were not designed to handle that many requests. At-fault divorces take a lot longer for a court to process. Another thing that we were seeing happen, and I talked about this in my video on no-fault divorce, at-fault divorce doesn't give room for a couple who consensually wants to divorce, but no one's did anything wrong. So if no one's the injured party, and both the husband and the wife agree that they'd like to have a divorce, the courts won't grant it to them. So what you started seeing back then before no-fault divorce is a lot of times a husband and wife would come together with their attorneys, even with the judges, and they would all basically collude. And they would draw up something that said, you know, one party was at fault, basically, in order to pass this through the courts as a divorce that can get processed. Otherwise, they were stuck with each other. If we go back to at-fault divorce, you know, there's going to be these issues. And we have to understand that the current legal structure we had is built on top of this whole legal substructure that used to be what was in place, and that if we just remove one thing, it's going to open up these same issues we had before. We should still have marriage reform that allows for people who are consenting to a divorce to get one. Now, if one person wants to leave the divorce, and this is typically the problem with no fault, is that it gives unilateral power to one party, meaning that only one person needs to want to get a divorce and that the courts will still grant it. If one person wants to leave and the other person isn't at fault for anything, they should then be giving up their claim on the majority of shares of marital assets and properties. So if you want to leave because you're tired of this and you're just not happy, you absolutely should be able to, and you can. However, that doesn't mean that you get the house. That doesn't mean you get first dibs on custody and all these kinds of things. So I could see something like that happening. The other thing is that the tradcons would rather see a religious authority take over marriage. You know, the problem I see with that is there's many different religious organizations here. They can't all agree. I think it's great when people go to their respective religious organizations for guidance on their marriage. I think those religious organizations should be able to conduct a ceremony free from the state for those people. But we have to acknowledge that we live in the United States and we have people who are very religious, who are less religious, people who are atheists. And I think marriage and divorce is probably still better kept under the umbrella of the state. What I'm basically saying is that if the progressive left offers marriage reform, they will offer it in the form of a secularized version of marriage, where when the tradcons do it, it's still under the hold of religious authorities. So aside from that, I think the important thing for red pillars to understand is that enough red pillars opting out of marriage is actually scaring these people, and they know that this is a problem. They will try to solve the problem by offering you a deal. The problem that the red pillars have is that they need to understand what is the deal that they're willing to take when they offer it. We have to understand what marital reform actually looks like, because the tradcons will come and say, all right, we're going to try to advocate to get rid of no-fault divorce, which is, you know, probably beneficial to some ways since it's so skewed against men right now. But there are other things that we need that they probably won't give us. One thing I always advocate for is caps on spousal and child support. That's just my axe to grind, frankly. I don't think someone needs $20,000 a month in child support, especially if someone decides to just leave and there was no injured party. The other person didn't do anything bad, right? So in that case, it's like you left, but you also are leaving the provider lifestyle for both spousal and child support. I think that should be capped to an amount that's determined at which jurisdiction handles the divorce or handles the child support case. So it could be different for LA County, it could be different for Sacramento. Okay. The next thing we need is paternity reform. Paternity reform is the one aspect of this that really oppresses men. Because, you know, a woman can have a baby and give that baby up for adoption tomorrow. They can lie and say, I don't know who the dad is. I can't do this. You know, they have a lot more control here. Okay. Men don't. And the way paternity laws work is that if a person is married and the child's born within the marriage, you are automatically legally that child's father. Because the way society looks at marriage is that any kids that are born within a marriage are your children. This has nothing to do with whether or not you're the biological father or not. Okay. The other way is if you sign the paperwork at a hospital, if you're unmarried, it's called a voluntary declaration of paternity, or if a judge makes you the father. Okay. Typically happens through child support agencies when they're coming after fathers for kids born out of wedlock. Now, let me just give you an example. The way California law works is if you're married to someone for 5 years and you guys got a 3-year-old and you guys are getting divorced, if you find out that that's not your child, there's nothing you can do about it, because you have till the child is 2 to be able to challenge paternity and to get a court to actually give you a judgment that says you're not the parent anymore. So what happens is guys end up in this situation where you find out the kid's not yours, but you're still on the hook for child support and financially being responsible for this child, right? I think in the age of genetic tests, which have completely changed the game here, that if a man finds this out, a man should be able to go to the court and be able to say, I don't want this relationship with this child anymore. I want to delegitimize this child and put it on mom to have to go talk to the child support agency and go after whoever the real dad is. We have genetic tests now. We can figure that out. I feel betrayed by this. I don't want to feel trapped in this. Now, if the man decides he wants to take care of the child for the remaining time, then that's his choice. You know, he can do that during the divorce proceeding or whatever. If he agrees to do that, the judge can issue another, order or judgment in the dissolution saying the father agreed to that, and he is on the hook now, and there's no one doing it. So in that sense, these are the reforms that we need. We need paternity reform. We need caps on spousal and child support. And we need some form of marriage reform that incorporates some aspects of at-fault divorce, but still allows for a no-fault divorce to occur, because we're running into a fundamental consent issue. The tradcons won't want to give us that because they're governed by, religious scripture, which says, people should not be getting divorced in the first place, right? But we should still allow people to consensually be able to divorce if they want to. And then if they're not consensual about it, the person who wants to leave is giving up claim over most of the marital assets. That's my opinion. Let me know what you think about that. Anyways, aside from the Ben Shapiro video, we had some action on Twitter. We had a lot of back and forth between Pearl and a lot of people attacking her basically based off of her looks, which isn't a very nice thing to do, and her basically advocating against what the tradcons are saying. Pearl then challenged the Daily Wire to a debate, a debate panel, and she also said that if they do the debate, she'd like to bring on some of the other Red Pill Manosphere creators, such as Coach Greg Adams, who I think would do amazing in that debate. He's very knowledgeable over at the Free Agent Lifestyle channel, and Better Bachelor. So the host of that is named Joker, and he talks a lot about this stuff, and I think he's had some back and forth with them on Twitter also. So that's the current state of the war between the tradcons and the red pillars, and I'll keep us updated. I'll keep my eye on it. It's been hard for me to look away because I find it so interesting. Anyways, let me know what you think down below. Please hit that like button. Please hit that subscribe button and share this video. We'll see you on the next one.